Welcome to another episode of Food, Nutrition, and Wellness with Dr. Dan Remley. Today we're going to be looking at depression with exercise, so stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Food, Nutrition, and Wellness with Dr. Dan Remley. He's a field specialist and an associate professor with the Food, Nutrition, and Wellness program at the Ohio State University Extension program. Dan, we have a very interesting program today dealing with depression with exercise. What do you mean by that?
Well, Patrick, you might know that exercise and physical activity can help us in a lot of different ways, but we all think physically it can help us physically be healthier and prevent chronic diseases like diabetes. And I've been on your show many times, I've talked about that. But what we don't sometimes talk about is how physical activity and exercise can help our mental health as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Oh, okay. All right. I know that when we go through certain seasons like Christmas or major holidays, sometimes individuals get a little bit depressed.
Yeah, it can be a situational type of thing where, we all have ups and downs, and certainly sometimes the year are more stressful than others. But I think we also need to recognize that there are certain mental health disorders that are that you clinically are diagnosed with, and depressive disorders. And so we'll talk a little bit about those, and we'll talk a little bit about how physical activity and exercise can help with some of those mental health challenges that many of us face.
Now, are you saying we need to probably get into some kind of gym or recreational facility where we work out? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I certainly would encourage everybody to develop some sort of physical activity plan. It doesn't have to be joining a gym. It could be walking 30 minutes a day for 4 or 5 days a week. But certainly the benefits of physical activity go beyond the physical, as I mentioned, and it can also benefit us mentally as well.
Oh, okay.
It can help our moods, if we do have a clinical problem, a clinical mental health issue like depression, physical activity can help with those challenges. But in general, people that are physically active tend to be tend to have more positive mental health and moods and that type of thing.
I know that we as human beings go through peaks and valleys of emotional situations, etc. Some days we just don't feel as excited as there are some other days. Right. And I think that's sort of the course. So we're not necessarily talking about those valley days where we're depressed. Sometimes we really get into a major depression.
Right, where there's a chronic chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's where depression. That's when we talk about depression and mental illness. And there's several types of depression and mental health disorders that we'd like to recognize today, and talk a little bit about how physical activity can help with mental health. But you're right, it's different from the sort of the regular ups and downs that we all face. We're talking more about clinical mental health challenges that people have. So today we'll talk about the different types of depression and talk a little bit about some of the signs and symptoms of depression, and then how exercise can alleviate some of these symptoms. And we'll distinguish between the physical activity and exercise. I've kind of alluded to both of those terms, so we'll define those. We'll talk about the benefits of exercise, some of the recommendations, and then how to overcome some of the barriers. So depression is actually one of the major mental health disorders in the United States. And it can result in severe impairments that interfere or limit with one's ability to carry out one's daily routines. And so people that have clinical depression often have trouble getting up out of bed, or even doing something as mundane as brushing teeth, going to school, going to work. These are all very challenging for some people with depression. So let's talk about some of those symptoms. So depression is defined as a period of at least 2 weeks when a person experiences a depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure in just doing daily activities. And so you mentioned sort of the day-to-day ups and downs that we all have, but not everybody experiences these chronic periods where they're just down and can't do the things that they enjoy doing in life. So here are some statistics behind depression. About 7% of the U.S. population has experienced depression, and this is a survey where they ask people, have you had any major depressive symptoms in the past year or so? And actually, depression is highest amongst adults that are aged 18 to 25 years old. So the kind of younger adults experience depression more than the older adults. And also females experience depression more than men too. So those are some interesting statistics. About 65% have received a combined care by a health professional and medication. And so in depression, you might be taking medication, but often depression is treated through some sort of a therapy, medication, but also counseling. So there's different types of depression that I'd like to talk about. And one is the persistent depressive disorder, and this is where you have a depressed mood that lasts for about 2 years or so. And you might have some ups and downs, but you have a kind of like a chronic state where you're depressed for a long period of time. Some people have many symptoms and others have fewer symptoms, but this is the first type of depression. The second is postpartum depression, and this is where pregnant women might experience the postpartum either during or after pregnancy. And then there's psychotic depression. So this is often a state where people experience like hallucinations, they'll see things, and that type of disorder. And then seasonal affective disorder. And this involves lack of sunlight. And so people will experience this at certain times of the year, primarily in the winter months. So on the onset of the winter months, people that have seasonal affective disorder might need some extra light to improve their moods. And then there's bipolar disorder. And bipolar is sort of extreme lows and extreme highs. And so people with bipolar disorder will have long periods of depression, but then they'll have periods of mania where they feel really good, and they kind of it cycles back and forth.
Would you say that bipolar disorder, most individuals, again, they go through those peaks and valleys, and we're so used to terming people, naming people, that we're not talking about those everyday valleys and peaks.
Right.
But
These
we're
are more
really
extreme.
talking,
Right.
more extreme, yeah.
And again, this is something that a psychologist or a psychiatrist would diagnose. So this is an actual clinical diagnosis.
I see.
And there's many other symptoms of bipolar too. This is some of the general symptoms.
Oh, okay.
So do you know anybody who's depressed, like in your family or your circle of friends? Or
Not to the extent that you're getting into. Again, there are times in which people do feel a little blue.
Right, but don't have the clinical diagnosis.
Right.
And I don't know if you know this either, but if you have anxiety is a disorder. But if you have chronic anxiety, that can lead to a depressive state. And and sometimes the mental can manifest as physical symptoms too. So like headaches or even body aches and that type of thing. We'll get more into that.
Oh, okay.
But, so if you have a lot of anxiety, you want to be treated. You might want to be treated as well.
Now, by anxiety, you're talking about just constantly feeling
worrying or being anxious
and
yes, yep.
Because there's a lot of individuals that are very fearful of the future. They're either guilty of the past or fearful of the future. And those tend to be very anxious.
Yes.
As to
Yeah,
what's
and a lot of
happening.
it's genetic too. So, we inherit it from our parents and our grandparents, and some people are genetically more prone to have anxiety, but it's triggered by the situations that you just described.
I see.
So let's get into some of the signs and symptoms of depression. One might be persistent, sad, anxious, empty moods, feelings of hopelessness, pessimism, irritability, decreased energy or fatigue. As I mentioned, it's hard for people, to get out of bed, maybe feeling guilty or worthless, loss of interest and pleasure in things that we enjoy doing, like hobbies, and difficulty sleeping, moving or talking more slowly, feeling restless, having trouble sitting still, kind of fidgety, difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making making choices. Sometimes people that have depression experience appetite or weight changes too. And so they may gain weight or they might lose weight too. They might not want to eat very much. And then in extreme cases, thoughts of death or suicide or suicidal attempts. And then aches or pains, headaches, cramps, a lot of those physical manifestations, even digestive issues. And these can be symptoms of depression and mental illness too. So often the mental manifests itself in the physical as well. And sometimes if you're physically disabled or have physical health challenges, that can lead to the mental health challenges as well. If you're in chronic pain, certainly that can lead to a depression state. So let's sort of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about physical activity and how physical activity might be able to be helpful in terms of moods and mental health and depression. So, Patrick, do you participate in physical activity at all?
I would say that around the house chores.
Yep, that counts.
Basically, my biggest exercise, I guess, would be is mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
But sitting on a tractor, is that really mowing the lawn? I don't know.
Well, I think it is a little bit. I think you're using your hands, and you're probably not as much as certainly push mowing for sure.
Right.
But it is, it's a little bit.
Yeah.
I know I always feel a little tired after I even get on the riding mower, but and you're outside too, so.
Right.
So I think there's probably a little bit of physical activity there, but anything gets your heart rate up.
Yeah.
You're working your muscles, that's considered a physical activity. So really, physical activity doesn't need to be going to the gym necessarily. It can be just sort of things that you do around the house, like if you work in the garden, if you wash your car, you do housework. They may be less intense, but they're still getting your heart rate up, and you're working with your muscles. And so those all are considered physical activities. And there's different types of physical activity. So there's moderate physical activity, and this is where you get your heart rate up and you're breathing up to a level where you can still have a conversation. And then there's your more vigorous types of physical activity. And so this is where you get your heart rate up and you're breathing up to a point where it's a little bit more challenging to have a conversation. So I always like to use walking versus running. So walking is more of most types of forms of walking are more moderate, because you can still have a conversation if you and I are to walk down the street. But if we're both jogging, it's harder to have that conversation.
Right.
And so exercise is typically, I think physical activity and exercise are often used interchangeably. But exercise is viewed as being more vigorous. And so usually it's sort of repetitive and planned. And so you think of like aerobics, going to an aerobics class, or actually jogging, or swimming, or lifting weights, or something like that. That's viewed as more of an exercise. But they're both pretty important, and the more you can sort of mix up, if you can combine sort of like moderate activities throughout the week with a few vigorous maybe, and even like weightlifting, that's sort of the ideal routine for people. But there's all types of benefits for physical activity, and we talked about, briefly we talked about some of the benefits with mental health and moods, improving moods. But it does strengthen your heart and improves your immune system, and that's really important in today's age where we're living through a pandemic. It lowers blood pressure, it can improve muscle tone, It can build bones and strengthen bones. It certainly helps the body improve its ability to use oxygen, and it can reduce our body fat. It makes us look better. It increases energy and does improve sleep. So when I play tennis, for example, it's much easier for me to go to sleep and stay asleep at night. And when I don't exercise, the days I don't exercise, I often wake up like around 3 o'clock and I can't get back to sleep. So exercise certainly helps me with my, with my sleep. But it increases our energy, well, to a certain extent. So after exercise, we actually feel better, and so we feel like we have more energy. It does help increase or maintain cognitive function, so we're more alert. It reduces stress, anxiety, and depression. It improves our self-esteem. It actually builds, develops new brain cells. So when we exercise, we're actually, over time, it can help develop new brain cells, actually develop our blood vessels in our brain too. So it has lots of benefits to the brain and brain health. So the recommendation is about 150 minutes a week for moderate activities. And that's like 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for just getting your heart rate up and your breathing up. And it doesn't have to be all at one time. So you don't have to go for a 30-minute walk. You can do incremental, 10-minute walks here and there. And I've seen people here at South Centers just walk around the large meeting room during the lunch break. Huh. So it can be built into our daily activities. And so rather than sit on the bench watching our kids play softball, or we can walk along the sidelines. So it can be incorporated into our daily routine.
One of the things that I've seen is that there's individuals who are at the desk no longer have chairs, that they stand.
They stand, yep. That's a great way to build in a little bit more activity into our lives as well. So the interesting thing about exercise, though, too, there's an optimal level. So between 2.5 to 7.5 hours, that's kind of like the optimal. But once you get above 7.5 hours, you kind of lose those benefits. And actually, people that exercise more than 7.5 hours a week, the studies show, they actually have worse mental health outcomes in some cases. This is from a study. So
now let's take a construction worker who is constantly exercising, if you want to call it that, whether it's loading brick or unloading wood. Does that pertain to that individual, or is it just someone that?
Well, this is what the study says. It says after 7.5 hours, symptoms of depression and anxiety actually increase sharply.
Wow.
So, and that's irrespective of the gender, age, or physical health status. So there's too much. There can be too much exercise, and it really too much exercise and physical activity is actually hard on the body too. It can produce inflammation, especially as you get older, harder on our joints and that type of thing. So, yeah, there's a balance there, and some people still have those. They get up into their 40s and 50s, they still have those physically demanding jobs. There's a lot of wear and tear on the body with that.
Yeah.
And too, the study says that it does have not only, it can also affect mental health as well when you get that much exercise.
Wow.
So there was another study that found that physical activity affected the participants' mood afterwards, but mood didn't affect the physical activity they engaged in later on. So physical activity affected how energetic participants felt and how long they slept. And these relationships went both ways. So the energy levels and sleep also affected how much physical activity participants later engaged in. So, you get that after physical activity, you sleep better and you feel better the next day, so you're more likely to be physically active the next day. Again, getting back to some of the exercise recommendations. Regular leisure time activity at any intensity provides protection against future depression. And so if you have depression that runs in your family and you're really worried about it, you can get these benefits from exercise to prevent future mental health problems. And I mentioned earlier that chronic anxiety can lead to depression. So, being more active on a regular basis can reduce anxiety and later depression symptoms. So getting back to our recommendations for physical activity, as I mentioned, it's 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, and that includes like brisk walking, dancing, housework, but also building in some muscle strengthening activities, so what we call anaerobic. You don't need, your heart rate and your breathing might not go up, but you're still working your muscles like you think lifting weights. It doesn't have to be weights, it can be soup cans, but something where you're working on your balance, your resistance, you're working on your muscles, and that's really important for metabolism. And we mentioned, depression, but all these types of things also can help prevent or delay some of these chronic conditions like diabetes and heart disease and that type of thing. What's really important is not to become couch potatoes too. The long periods of sitting are very detrimental, not only to our health, but our mental health as well. And so we want to break those long periods of sitting with just getting up and moving around. You mentioned the standing desk, standing up, but that's really important, is to avoid that sedentary behavior, because that's linked with a lot of the health conditions, but also mental health as well. So it's tough though, isn't it, being active? Because a lot of times we're tired, and especially if we have depression or anxiety, we feel overwhelmed, we feel helpless, we feel bad about ourselves, we might feel pain, but physical activity can address all these issues, and they can help us. Physical activity, even short amounts of physical activity, can give us energy and can feel like we have better control over our lives and help us feel more helpful for the future. So it's kind of like breaking this cycle. And it doesn't have to be going to the gym every day. It can just be getting up and taking a walk for 10 minutes, breaking up those sitting periods, doing housework, anything, getting us off our chairs, off our couches can help with our mental health. So some tips to stay motivated here. Try to find things that you really enjoy. I enjoy playing tennis, and so that's typically what I will do for my physical activity. I play this game called pickleball. I don't really enjoy running very much. Sometimes I'll go for a jog, but it won't be for very long. So if you really like physical activity and like those activities, then you should stick with those and find things that you enjoy doing. Be comfortable too. And so if you're not comfortable and it's painful, that adage, no pain, no gain, that's not really good advice. You want to be a little bit discomfort, but not to the point where you're in pain. And reward yourself. So set a very specific goal and then reward yourself. Take yourself out to eat, whatever, if you achieve your goal. And then try to make physical activity a social activity as well. Like when I play pickleball, I have a group of friends that I play with, or tennis, and that's kind of like my social network. And so there's a lot of research also suggesting that the more friends we have, the more social connections that we have, the better off we are too, in terms of our health and well-being. And unfortunately, Patrick, for men, we have less friends than women. So we need to work on that.
Dan, I feel invigorated because of this program, and I really want to thank you with all the information. Let's sort of sum up. What one thing would you like the listening audience to take with them before we end the show?
Well, I would say number one is that if you do experience any of those signs and symptoms of depression or mental health, that you go see a certified health care provider, professional, to get a diagnosis. And certainly physical activity and exercise it's not a cure for these problems, but it can help address some of the symptoms of mental health disorders. But also it's important to be active and avoid too much sedentary behavior to prevent these problems in the future as well. And certainly if we all experience, as you mentioned, the ups and downs, but chronically too many of these ups and downs can create problems, and lack of sleep, chronic disease certainly can manifest into a mental health challenge. And so physical activity is one of those things and one of those behaviors that we can practice most days of the week.
Hey, we're talking with Dr. Dan Remley. He's a field specialist and associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program, Food, Nutrition, and Wellness. Dan, thank you.
Thank you.